Good evening, everyone. This is Teresa Placencia, your school superintendent of District 60. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us this evening on our finance update. I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening. If you give me 1 minute, I am playing with some technology right now. Marvin Bembray, who is the president of MKB Leadership Transformation Development and a certified speaker, trainer, executive coach with the John Maxwell team. Many of us know John Maxwell. He writes many books on leadership. A sought-after leadership coach, facilitator, mentor, and speaker who helps individuals and teams to develop the ability to communicate and collaborate in a world-class level so they can increase their business results. His skills were honed through his 30 years experience in human resources, training, organizational development, and government affairs for large global corporations. In addition, he has led and facilitated trainings, functions, and for thousands of people on a variety of leadership topics, strategic planning, diversity and inclusion, and personal empowerment courses. He was a pioneer in setting up diversity training and culture change in 2 large businesses and 1 faith-based organization. He has international experience, having been a speaker trainer for organizations in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America. Welcome, Mr. Bembray, who will be our moderator this evening. Before I turn it over to Mr. Bembray, I'd like to acknowledge our board members who are joining us this evening. Brandon Ewing, who is our president, Rick Riddle, who is our vice president, Mrs. Lucy Leguizamo, Edgar Castellanos, Ms. Anita Hanna, who's our senior board member, Mr. McBride, Ms. Shar Callahan-Wozniak. Thank you for joining us this evening. Mr. Bembray, I will turn it over to you so you can set operating norms. Enjoy our presentation. Mr. Bembray, we cannot hear you. I'd also like to acknowledge, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge that Representative Rita Mayfield has joined us, and my understanding is State Senator Johnston will also be joining us. I do not know if she's on the meeting as of yet, but I just want to acknowledge their presence this evening, and thank you for joining us.
All right, can you hear me now? Thank you, Ms. Placencia, for your kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. In fact, I'm honored and privileged to be asked to add value to this important discussion. Since this is Black History Month, I'd like to just offer a quote by Dr. King, who said that the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. And ladies and gentlemen, sometimes in the pathos of life and living, we are reminded of the cruciality of the education process. And as a consultant, I support leaders and institutions across multiple industries, including education. And over the last year, I, along with many others, have gained a new appreciation for the value of our teaching and educational systems. Although normal has shifted, and we are facing the emerging realities of transition, one thing is clear and constant. We need our education systems, and we need them to function and operate at levels perhaps never before, and to continue to add value to our communities. Confucius said that education brings confidence. Confidence breeds hope, and hope breeds peace. And looking at our society today, I think it is clear that all of us would agree that we need more confidence, hope, and peace. And so it is the intent of tonight's forum to create an opportunity for you, the public, to become perhaps even more acutely aware of the strong financial position of one of the most important institutions in our community, and that is the Waukegan public education system. Tonight's presentation is intended to instill confidence, hope, and peace concerning both the leadership of the district and in their management of a budget that has been entrusted to them by the citizenry of this great community. With that, allow me to set the operating norms for our discussion tonight so that we might be able to both effectively and efficiently create a moment for maximum impact. It should be stated at the outset here that the discussion tonight, while intended to be very informative, may not be exhaustive, meaning that the district may not be able to provide some on-the-spot exhaustive answers because this is a very complex process. But it is designed to give you a tremendous amount of information, much more than a bird's eye view. So here are the norms that will assist us tonight. I would ask that we be very considerate and respectful in our conversation. If you choose to participate in the chat, I'm going to ask you to really lean in, and if you have a question, pose that question in a very respectful and considerate way in the chat. And let's just be in remindance or in memory that this is a professional kind of moment. We're dealing with professionals, and we would love for everyone to respect that professional and respectful norm. I'd like to ask that any question that you might have for additional clarity based on the presentation, that you note that in the chat. And if there are any other questions even outside of the presentation, you can note those in the chat. It's quite likely that some of the questions that have been submitted in advance may be answered in the presentation, but if not, you can certainly feel free to note those questions in the chat. If there's something where you need additional clarity or further insight, please submit that question in the chat. There will be another member outside of me that will be monitoring the chat in order to do due diligence. Again, we're asking that all clarifying questions be submitted via the chat. Please be considerate and respectful in your communication and recognize that our purpose here tonight is information exchange and learning. I'd like to also ask that you keep your lines muted, and that will allow us to experience the session without undue noise and distraction. Remember also, if you have your camera on, remember your surroundings and be careful that your camera does not pick up anything that you wouldn't want it to pick up. Finally, we will try to be expeditious with regard to our time frame, and it's our aim to be respectful of your time. I'd like to thank you again, as Ms. Placencia did, for joining us tonight and adhering to the norms that I just laid out. We'd like to acknowledge all of you that have joined, our community, political, and other leaders. Your support means so much to the success of this district. So let's lean in, listen with an open heart and mind, and let's see what we're able to learn and discover tonight. And so with that, it is my pleasure today to present Mrs. Wendell Polk, an Associate Superintendent of Waukegan Public Schools, who's going to give us a presentation, and then others that might be presenting, she will produce or introduce those. After the presentations, I'll ask some of the questions that came in advance per the 48-hour request, and as time allows, those in the chat. So let's lean in, let's give a big welcome. Mrs. Gwendolyn Polk, would you take the floor at this time? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brimber, for your kind words. Thank you very much for moderating this meeting this evening. I would like to respectfully request that those who are not speaking, if you would turn your cameras off so that we can focus on the presentation tonight, and only the moderator and myself should have our cameras on. Thank you very much for complying. Greetings, Board President, board members, staff, distinguished guests, State Representative Rita Mayfield, and State Senator Johnson, and community members. It is our pleasure tonight to present to you a finance update for our school district. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The first information that I would like to present to you would be awards and recognition related to our financial condition. For those of you who may not know who I am, my name is Wendell Polk. I've been in the district for over 14 years. In the current position in which I serve, I've been in this position since 2014. Over the course of this time, you will see how our finances have evolved. And I'm very proud to say that we've done extremely well as a district to improve our financial standings. Next slide, please. According to ISB's financial recognitions, you'll see over the course of time, we've provided for you information related to from 2003 through 2020, which is our audited information. You'll notice that to the left, during some time, we've had some delayed payments because for a long period of time, the state did not have a budget. And so as a result of that, they considered the amount of delayed payments we would have, and they adjusted our financial recognition standings. In recent years, since the state has had a budget, we've not had significant delays in our payments. Therefore, you'll notice that in 2018 through 2020, that our status has remained somewhat consistent between the original payments and delayed payments. You'll also notice that our rating for the last 3 years has been recognition. This is admirable for a district. When you see in 2003, we're on the watch list. Recognition, for those of us who may want to know, is the highest level considered at the ISB, at the state level. Next slide, please. We've also had the privilege of submitting our budget documents, our adopted budget documents, to the Association of School Business International for the MBA, which is known as the Meritorious Budget Award. We've been recipients of this award 6 times, and the years are depicted here. And this award, it promotes and it recognizes school districts that have the best budget presentation practices in school districts across the country. Applications and our budget documents are submitted to a highly regarded panel of financial experts who review those documents and consider our district to be among the highest rated districts across the country. Next slide, please. We've also opted for many years to go beyond just the annual financial statement. We wanted to do a comprehensive review of our financial records, and therefore our auditors and independent auditor come within our district. They do our annual financial statement, which is on a cash basis, and then they do our comprehensive annual financial review, which is on an accrual basis. The accrual method is sent to the Association of School Business Officials International in the form of a Certificate of Excellence in Financial Reporting, and we've won that for 12 years, 12 awards, and the years are depicted here. And this award, as highlighted beneath the years, is a commitment to transparency and high quality financial reporting. Next slide, please. The first year upon my arrival, one of the things that I wanted to do was to submit our budget to GFO, Government Finance Officers Association, which does not only include school districts, but it includes other municipalities. And so we won that award in 2014. Highlighted here, you'll see that the documents, as with the previous awards, are high quality documents that reflect both the guidelines established by the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting and the GFO's best practices on budgeting. It recognizes districts such as ours that exceed those standards and goals. Next slide, please. One would ask, what is the history of our credit rating? Next slide. And more information regarding this, you will hear when we talk about the debt of our district. Ms. Elizabeth Hennessy is going to speak to that. But we get our financial rating from Standards & Poor's, which is commonly known as S&P. It is one of the most prominent. Would you please mute your mic? Thank you. It is one of the most prominent financial intelligence companies in the world. And they rated our district high. And you'll see that in subsequent slides. Next slide, please. We wanted to show you here what are the rating standards of the scale, Standards & Poor's rate districts. The lowest being in default, a D, and the highest being a AAA, which is extremely strong. I'll give you a moment to review these. Next slide, please. Where is District 60? Well, you'll notice at the bottom of this slide, at the top of the slide rather, November 17, 2006, District 60 was a triple B rating. That's okay. We had a fairly adequate financial rating, but we wanted to do something far better for Waukegan Public Schools. And so we worked extremely hard, and you'll notice that on October 30th, 2009, our rating increased from a triple B to an A-. And still, we were not satisfied with having a rating at that level. And so we continued to work extremely hard, coupled with our financial advisor and our bond counsel, to get our rating to an A rating. And we have an A rating yet today. And if we were to get rated again, I am confident that our rating would go even higher. An A rating signals that we have a strong financial footing and we're able to pay our debt and our bills. Next slide, please. What kind of budget strategies do we have? Well, in our district, approximately 7 years ago, we converted from what was a rollover budget. A rollover budget which a department, a division, a school, they get a budget that they've traditionally had. It's not associated with strategies, goals, or anything like that, but it's based upon historical spending. We shifted to what was originally known as zero-based budgeting, and then we changed the name to what we know now as strategic budget planning. Why did we shift to this methodology? Well, we moved from wide funding differences across schools. It was unplanned, as I just mentioned, inconsistent across the schools based on size and needs, program offerings, and locations. In some instances, we were giving schools merely based on enrollment and not considering the needs of their schools. But with strategic budget planning, we've moved to a principle of providing resources to schools that is equitable, it's flexible, it's transparent, and it's geared towards meeting the needs of the students that are in that school. It's equity-based, and the cost is associated with identified needs and priorities of the district, and particularly that school. Next slide, please. This is reiterating what I said on the previous slide. What is the importance of equitable funding? Differentiation between the student needs in the schools. Flexible spending is driven by the unique needs and the instructional vision of each school. Each school leader is the one who knows their schools better. They're the individuals who can tell us about their students and about their buildings. They're the CEO of their building, and they're the best one to tell us exactly what their student needs are. Transparent systems. We constantly have training sessions for our school leaders. We constantly have budget workshops annually, at least 2, to inform the community. And that's after we've had a budget development committee whereby we have a multitude of representatives, those from the schools, those from the communities, our parents, school leaders, department leaders, grant managers, a part of the decision-making when building out our budgets on an annual basis. And because we do that, we believe that we're building trust and vision and accomplishing us to accomplish our strategic budget plan. Next slide, please. Each year, we're required to develop a budget calendar, and we stick to that. I'll give you a moment to review it, but it starts with year-end closeout procedures, where we typically send out information to all of our departments, all of our schools, all of the offices within our district, and let them know that there's a particular day that we're going to cut spending off. The ideal behind this is one that I was really taught from years of being in the military as a financial person, that if we shift the monies back to the main organization, then we're able to funnel the money back out to address unfunded needs at a particular time in the year. And so that's where that methodology evolved. And so we send that out to the schools, to the departments, and we cut spending off. Last day to submit requisitions in this particular case, April 16th of 21. And that's why. The last day to pay all of the open POs, that means all of the purchase orders that are in our system that are non-grant, is May the 21st of 21. This allows us to submit all of our expenditures to the board before the year ends. And you'll see on this slide, we have Budget Workshop 2, Budget Workshop 3, as well as the one that I omitted to mention, which was Budget Workshop 1. And finally, the budget hearing and adoption on September 8th of 2021. We're statutorily required to get our budget adopted by the end of September, but we pride ourselves in not waiting until the last minute to do that in case there's adjustments that are required. Next slide, please. This is a short video clip of one of our strategic progress monitoring meetings with our principals. And we wanted you to have a moment just to hear what the principals are feeling and saying about our strategic budget planning process. If you would start the clip, please.
In terms of the money and the funds and the budgeting, I think in terms of the money and the funds and the budgeting, I don't know that anyone would, right? So that's really, I think in terms of the progress monitoring goals and SIP and how we're moving, all of the progress monitoring is done monthly with ILT, the members actually go through and progress monitor our goals. So I do think that they would be able to speak to the goals that we have in place and the work that we've done. So twofold, right? But in terms of like that budgeting piece, I do think that the greatest thing about SBB is also my secretary's understanding of our priorities and why we do what we do, right? In the past, it's always been around order this or get these done. But she really sees the bigger picture of, we need this resource for this. And it also helps when she's talking to parents and fielding questions, because she gets that piece of inventory when materials come in, and that sort of stuff. So
I think for sure, the old way was more of a one-size-fits-all approach to and I worked in the district office, so I was part of those decisions as well, right? And so we would make a decision like, this is the program that we're going to buy and everyone's going to use it. Yet it doesn't take into consideration, I have the small gifted population, or I know Sabrina has a very large dual language population. And so it really, and that's I think some of my frustration as well. With things like, we're writing the plan, this is site-based budgeting, so you're asking us what we need, right? And what programs that we want to be able to monitor. And then at the last minute, we have some of our ASAP departments saying, we're purchasing this for everybody. I don't know if, this is just Amy Grossman's opinion, I don't know if that's as necessary anymore, because if you're asking each school what they need, right? And we know that we're going to monitor it and try to continue to figure that out. There's a lot of stuff out there for sure, right? But what works for my building and the way that I would roll it out in my building might be different than the way that Sabrina does it in hers. And so we'll really be able to look at our own student population and what works, for our own students. That's just my initial thoughts.
But yes, getting the opportunity to say what you need in your place for your kids is good. It's a good thing. But then trying to balance the requirements of the district with what you say you need. So like one time I listed, I don't know how many years I went, I had everything listed of all the online programs that were bought and available. And it's just like, I have to use Fast Forward for $10,000 for Fast Forward. So I need to use that. So I had to figure away like, this is the requirement. Other stuff you can use to supplement to add a little variety, but this is going to be a shift in mindset too, as far as how does that work? How does what the ASAP department or any other department do compared to those schools that are saying, this is what I need, just let me get what I need and let me run, let me go. Like, how do we transition? Because we're not just the ones transitioning, it's also the district that is transitioning on expectations for each of the buildings.
The SBB process and completing the PowerPoint, doing the spreadsheets for monitoring, it makes us focus so much more clearly on the priorities and what we need to do. Then if we have the shift, we know where we're going, so we can say, okay, what's the modification that happens even though this pandemic has hit us? And I just think this process has been so beneficial for clarity of what we need to do. And then the other thing too that I would say is I feel like there's a good deal of flexibility. So like we've run into issues where we can't necessarily allocate the funds as we would wish. But then as we look for other strategies to support the major goals, we can shift that in the budget a little bit more easier than some of the grants and stuff like that. So I would say absolutely yes. I think it brings us clarity and it makes us a lot more comfortable.
At one point, I thought this whole practice was going to be cumbersome, but it really isn't. It has really helped me and helped my team to focus on what it is that we want to do and not veer away from that. It sparked a lot of conversations, not just with my ILT, but with my grade level teams, my content teams, about this is the direction we want to go. And every time we talk about or make a decision or start talking about how does this support what we're trying to do. So it really keeps us focused so that when we decide that we want to purchase, whether it's some online tool or whatever the case may be, we're saying how this is supporting what we're going to do. How is this going to support that? So.
Thank you very much for listening to our principal's perspective on our strategic budget planning process. I'll just give Mr. Moten an opportunity to bring the slides back up. There it is. How financial commitments are made. Next slide, please. In order for us to spend any of our money, first and foremost, there is a budget review. We make sure that funds are available in our adopted budget. Equally as important, we ensure that the source of funds that we're using is permissible, whether it's local, which we have more flexibility in using, as well as our evidence-based funding, or whether it's categorical aid, which is dedicated for particular purposes, whether it's state or federal grants or flow through the state. Next slide, please. How contracts and other financial commitments are made. In some instances, there is a requirement that legal review, particularly if it's a contract. They look at the contracts, compare it to statute and other laws, and make sure that we're in full compliance with statutory requirements. Next slide, please. Then those commitments are presented to the board. A decision is made whether to commit the funds in alignment with board policies. And then the commitments are presented and approved. All commitments are presented to the board and approved by the board, whether it's retroactively approved or approved prior to paying the bills. Next slide, please. Now we're going to look at the financial picture of our district. Next slide, please. This slide shows a lot of the history of our district dating back to FY14-15. Excuse me. You'll note here that in the education fund, we had 4.3 million. And based upon our audited report in FY20, we have $42.3 million. If you look across, you'll see the total to the far right, that in 14-15, we had 33.6 rounding up $million across all of our operating funds. It's important to mention that operating funds include the education fund, O&M fund, transportation fund, and the working cash fund. And you'll note in FY20, that number has increased from the 33.6 million to 74.3 million, something to be very proud of. At the bottom in the footnotes, you'll see that periodically we have loans from the working cash fund to fill cash shortfalls, because obviously you cannot spend money that you don't have. Therefore, we have a board resolution that has been approved and adopted by the board to do temporary loans to other funds. Next slide, please. This slide is also very important because we wanted to show you there is a goal in a board policy as shown here, 3103, that our goal is to maintain at least a 90-day days of cash on hand. You'll notice in the numbers that are depicted here, in FY20, according to the annual financial report, we had approximately 129.64 days of cash on hand. And based upon the budget document that was adopted, not necessarily what is going to happen because the budget document is a projection, we have approximately 48.87 days of cash on hand. And that's assuming that we would spend 100% of what we've budgeted. Next slide, please. We wanted to show the 3 state categorical aid grants that we have. The TAOP grant, which is primarily used over at AOEC, and the 2 early childhood grants, one for 0 to 3 and one for 3 to 5. You'll notice that we have an allotment of $3.9 million, of which we've received $625,000 from the state to date, and there's a remainder of $3.3 million that we're awaiting disbursement. Next slide, please. These are our federal categorical aid. Again, you'll see that our allotment for federal as of February the 12th was $18.43 million. We've gotten about $112,000. And so we're waiting for about $18.32 million. Next slide, please. This slide will answer a lot of the questions that we receive relative to property taxes. We've included on this slide, I'm sorry that it's somewhat small, but I think you'll get the gist of what we're trying to say here. The actual tax year of 2012 to tax year 2019, and obviously we have not submitted our tax extension for tax year 20. That will be in about April when we have to do that. But we wanted to show on this slide, if you look at 2012 to the far right, the second column from the right, you'll notice that the total actuals that we received was $73.2 million. And in 2013, it was a significant drop because we all realized that the equalized assessed valuation of our property went down. And so the district lost about 22.81% of its state of its tax revenue because our tax extension went down to $56.5 million, a significant reduction. We've prided ourselves, and historically over the years, we've said that we're not going to raise the taxes to the level that we had in 2012. And so you'll notice if you go all the way down to 2019, there was a 0% increase. The number was relatively the same because if you look at 2018, it was $62.34 million, whereas in 2019, it was 62.33. And so carrying it out 2 spaces is 0% increase. And in 2020, because our debt payments are lower, our overall reduction is 2.42 that we're anticipating. Just want to give you a moment to look at that. And even with that reduction and even with the slight increases over the years, we're still not up to what we were in 2012. Next slide, please. On this slide, this depicts our adopted budget. It shows you one of the things that I want to point out on this slide the total direct receipts and revenues, you'll notice in the education fund, that's the one that I want to primarily point out on this slide, is $201 million. And you'll notice down where the total direct disbursements and expenditures are, it's approximately or estimated to be 220 million. So in the current year, if you were to take that $201 million and subtract the 220 million, that means we would have a deficit in the current fiscal year of 18.9 million. But because we started the year with a positive balance of 42.6, we're able to end estimated ending of 23.7. And I know oftentimes we get questions about why do you have that huge surplus of fund balance coming in? Well, most, if not all, prudent business managers, without knowing what the budget is going to be at the state level and without knowing what the taxes are going to be, because if you recall this year, we had a delay in receipts of our taxes. And so it's wise that we do not exhaust all of our funds and all of the funds that are depicted here, but have a reserve so that in the event we have a proration at the state level or a huge reduction at the state level or a delay in receipt of our property tax, then we would remain solvent. One of the things that I want to call to your attention is when the state did not have a budget, our district was able to retain the staff because of our financial management practices, and we remained solvent during that time without having to go out for a tax anticipation warrant or the like. We're very proud of that. Next slide, please. Wanted to show you here our fund balances in the funds as of January 31st of 2021. You'll also see the beginning towards the bottom of this statement. You'll see what the beginning fund balance was coming into the beginning of this fiscal year. And you'll see what the iVision's total fund balance is now. This is only depicting the debt service fund, IMRF fund, capital projects fund, working cash, TART, and life safety. There should be a slide that shows the education fund, O&M fund, transportation fund. But we could see our cash balance here. Somehow we skipped it on the fund balance, but it's easy to see it here. You'll see in the education fund, local and grant. In our district, we try to separate out, although they're both the education fund, but just for management purposes, we separate out the local portion of the education fund from the grant. So our local portion, we label that as Fund 10, and our grant portion, we label it as Fund 11, but it's all the education fund. Without loans, we're showing here. Without loans, we're showing here that we have a balance of 59.1 cash-wise, and with loans, 57.9. The 57.9 is because if you look towards the bottom of this spreadsheet, you'll see below life safety, you'll see that there's insurance adjustments, there's revenue that we have to book, there's First Midwest wires and payment transfers that we have to book, and there's interest on schedules of investments that we also have to book. And that's where we have the adjustments. When we're presenting information to the board, the superintendent, the Board of Education, and to the community, we want to show everything. We want to show even those things that we're aware of that are not necessarily booked into our system. And you'll note here to the left, without the loans, we have several funds that are negative. You cannot spend money that you do not have. Therefore, we have the working cash fund that is our internal loaning institution. So we don't have to go out and get a loan. So we're able to take some of that 27.3 million, it's 27,291,003, and we're able to loan it to the debt service fund and loan it to the capital projects fund. Does that mean that towards the end of the year, those funds are going to be negative? Absolutely not. It's the timing of receipts. And it's also not transferring some of our evidence-based funds receipts into those funds until the latter part of the year, because we like to keep our cash in the education fund at an acceptable level. But if you were to refer to our budget document, you will note that we have some of our evidence-based funds that are going into the capital projects fund, and some of them are going into the TART fund. The negative in the debt is merely because we're receiving some of our property taxes in the month of May and June. Timing of receipts. Next slide, please. So what is our financial outlook? I mean, what is it that we want to do in the budget office? We want to balance the requests for funding and planning for the future. That's one of the things that we always do in my office. We don't look at the current year. We look at least, at the very least, 3 years ahead, if not 5 years ahead. There's a lot of unknowns, but one of the knowns that we know is historical trends. And so we use historical trends to make projections within our district. And that's what one of the things that we pride ourselves on. In anticipation of possible budget shortfalls, I mentioned that just a moment ago. That's the reason why we maintain an adequate beginning fund balance so that we could respond to whatever shortfalls that may occur. The district utilizes the strategic budget planning process, and I went over that. WPS 60, as with other school districts across the globe, we're all contending with COVID-19. And this situation, as you've heard on many other occasions, is very fluid. It's a situation that we have to respond and react to. And anytime we're responding and reacting to things, there's money in most cases associated with it. That's why it's always good to have an ending fund balance that we're able to respond to unforeseen circumstances, situations such as COVID-19. Our employee cost is the greatest cost in our district, as with most organizations. And so we're saying that on average, our expenses for salary and benefits makes up about 75% of our operating budget. That's why it is imperative that we continue to consider the effects of salary and benefits when we're planning our budget. And finally, we have a strong desire to improve student outcomes, which is why the student outcomes strongly influence how and to what programs resources are allotted. You heard our principals from their perspective, how our budget is developed. They're instrumental in letting us know how we should spend our money, and their voices are heard, as with those of our parents, as with those of our community members that are part of our budget development committee, as with those who are part of our board. And subsequently, that information, as I've said before, is presented to the Board of Education and our community on at least 2 or 3 occasions, so that we can hear the sentiments of our community and make the necessary adjustments based on what we're hearing and based upon the recommendations from those that are on the ground and those that are closest to our students. And that's the principals. Next slide, please. So now I want to introduce a remarkable person who has helped us tremendously in the area of our debt, and that's Ms. Elizabeth Hennessy.
Good evening. Thank you, Gwen. My name is Elizabeth Hennessy, and I have been fortunate to work with Gwen in District 60 for many years. So my goal tonight is to give you an overview of the district's debt and a little bit of history. So next slide, please. These first few slides are a recap of some of the things that Gwen was mentioning, looking at district resources and how they have improved so much under the state's evidence-based funding formula. It's certainly brought their resources up to par with many other districts in the state. And you can see the local, state, and federal portions of over the last 5 years here. And you can see the tremendous growth from 2016, total revenues of $163.4 million to fiscal year 2020 with $210 million total revenues. Next slide. Thank you. Here are the revenues and expenditures, and you can see that revenues and expenditures have been very close. Back in 2016, there was a very slight surplus. 17 was a slight deficit. 2018, that was one of the first years that evidence-based funding really kicked in. And there was a large surplus in that year to help rebuild district fund balances. 2019 and 2020 also generated surplus revenues over expenditures. And these are in the district's key funds of education, O&M, and working cash. Next slide, please. Here's the general fund and the O&M fund balances by fiscal year. Again, a really great picture of growth. And we focus on these slides because these are what the rating agencies look at, and it shows that the district is handling its funds so well in its budget management and growing fund balances, so the district has stability and is able to finance the programs that are most important to it for children. Next slide. Here is that key ratio, the operating fund balances as a percent of expenditures. Gwen mentioned this, that the district's fund balance policy is 25% fund balance, operating fund balance as a percent of expenditure. And that goes to that day's cash on hand. And here you can see that it's over that target of 25%, not by a huge amount, but by a positive amount, ending with a fund balance that is 32% of annual expenditures in the fiscal year 2020 most recently. Next slide. Here, I want to talk about the district's statutory debt limit. As well as improving fund balance and budget performance over the past 5 years, the district's tax base has finally started to grow after the very negative impacts of the Great Recession. And that has increased the district's debt limit. At the same time, the district has paid off a majority of their bonds. So right now, the district has only 24.28 million of direct general obligation debt, leaving the district under the statutory debt limit just under 100 million borrowing authority. Now, just so you understand, the district can't just go out and borrow that much money. It has to have a way to pay it back. And most borrowing is done either via referendum or it is done with payback through the operating funds, but it must fit within district's budget. And as we were discussing in the prior section, it must work with the district's educational priorities with programming funding versus capital funding through the issuance of debt. Next slide, please. Here's the district's outstanding debt service and tax rate for debt. If you remember on one of the prior slides, we looked at all the different funds, all the funds that Gwen was looking at are mostly operating funds. The debt service fund is a separate fund, and that pays for non-referendum debt service as well as voter-approved referendum debt service. If you look in the middle of the page, you can see that the district only has 3 more payments before its voter-approved bonds are completely paid off. The last payment on referendum bonds is actually in 2021. Non-referendum debt is paid off by 2029. The tax rate for bonds and tax payments drop by over $200 for the owner of a $100,000 market value home over the next 3 levy years between 2020 and 2022. So the repayment of that debt is going to result in lower taxes for community. Next slide, please. So here are just some debt highlights since 2010. In 2010, the district restructured its outstanding debt to create level annual debt service payments as opposed to increasing annual payments, which would have increased payments, especially when equalized assessed valuation was declining when we were in the Great Recession. In 2010, the district also refunded debt, saving over $652,000 in interest costs. In 2011, the district qualified for a Capital Development Board construction grant from the state of Illinois in the amount of $28.3 million if it could provide matching funds of $9.6 million. The district did this with a low-cost loan from a local bank. Then in 2016, the district was also awarded access to qualified school construction grant bonds. So that's a bond issue where the federal government will pay the interest cost on the bond. So the district, in fact, only needs to pay the principal back. So it's basically an interest-free loan. Next slide, please. I guess that's it.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your presentation. Now we want to talk about the state panels. Next slide, please. And this is going to be very brief. What are the historical requirement conditions for a state panel? The local school board, or ISB, have to petition for a state panel. And the school district in question is in grave financial trouble as when the district A, failed or likely will fail to meet regularly scheduled payroll or debt service payments. B, the district failed to file an annual financial report or other required financial information with ISB. Or C, has been identified through the district's annual audit as being in serious financial difficulty in the current or next school year. Waukegan Public Schools does not meet any of these criteria. Next slide, please. What is the historical statutory power of state panels? Under the current statute, a state panel can exercise financial control over the local board of education. They have the power to veto or approve any school board decision that has a financial impact, such as property taxes, school district budgets, any spending plan that allocate budgeted resources, any of our bonds, collective bargaining agreements, contracts for goods and services, and even appointment of the local school board treasurer, of which I serve. Next slide, please. At this point, we turn the floor back over to Mr. Bembry and the questions that were asked of us and the question pool we're prepared to answer.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Polk, and for that very thorough and detailed presentation. I think that it's pretty clear that there's lots of information that has been provided that speaks to the good shape and management of the budget there that you all are using. So there were a number of questions that were submitted in advance. And so we're going to give preference and priority to those questions as the district has had an opportunity to prepare responses for those. Some of the questions might be kind of massaged into others in the interest of time and in some cases to avoid some duplicity. There might be some duplicity which creates an opportunity for emphasis. So we're going to go ahead and start with those questions. Now, the original intent of this meeting was to be 90 minutes. So that gives us about 25 minutes or so left for these questions. And so we want to be as expeditious as possible with regard to that. So there was a question that spoke about property taxes. There might have been a few questions about property taxes. And I want to just kind of get to the heart of one of the questions, which was, at what point will the district be in a position to lower property taxes?
Well, we pride ourselves in the fact that on that one slide where we showed the property taxes, that we have leveled the property taxes in tax year 2019. That was a 0% increase. In 2020, tax year 2020, what was submitted to the board for adoption was our tax levy. Our tax levy is submitted prior to submitting our extension, which is normally done in April. We put it at the statutory limit of 5% or less than what was levied the previous year, because we don't know what the EAV is going to be. We don't know a lot of information. So it's prudent budgeting for us to go up to the statutory limit and then bring it down to what the leveled amount is and what the board is directing us to do when we submit our extension. And so the information that we provided tonight, which was what we propose is going to be the extension. You notice it was over 2% reduction over the previous year.
Great, thanks very much. There was the ending part of your presentation, Mrs. Polk, spoke about the criteria for state panel assuming responsibility. Would you like to just add just an additional emphasis on that? There was a question that that pondered the notion that since or if the district is as stable as is being presented, what is the purpose of this potential takeover or oversight group? And I know that you answered that, but would you like to add any additional or clarifying answer to that question as well?
Well, there were also a question that was related to the cost, and according to ISB, there is normally a nominal cost associated with the oversight panel. Cost is typically mileage, unless the panel chooses to hire a chief executive officer, a superintendent, or a business manager, or a treasurer, or a legal officer. The cost of travel or the hires is paid by the district. And additional hires are possible, inclusive of the chief academic officer.
Great. Thank you for that additional info with regard to that question per your previous answer. There was a question that spoke to teacher salaries and becoming more competitive with regard to teacher salaries in an effort to begin to mitigate turnover rate. So the juxtaposition of this question is, if the district has increased its funds, why hasn't there been kind of a commensurate increase in terms of teacher salaries and to attract additional teachers?
Well, I want to briefly respond to that question. WPS 60 salary schedule is a negotiated instrument, or the tier model is a negotiated instrument between the district and the unions. There has been a sizable raise each year. It's important to mention that the base salary for teachers is approximately $63 million. And a 4% increase would equate to something like $2.5 million. I mentioned in the presentation that salaries overall make up about 75% of the district's budget. Positions don't go away. We may not get revenue that equates to inflation and or the increases in salaries. So in terms of turnover, there are various reasons why people leave. I'm told that one reason is the distance that some people are traveling to get to our district. Equally as important, it's important that I mention that we do have some teachers that make in excess of $100,000 per year. So I believe that our salaries are comparable with most districts our size and with our financial status.
Great. Thanks for kind of showing that continuum there. So there were some questions about the purchase of the bank building and questions about the amount of money that's been spent on that building, what fund did it come from? Why don't we start with those two questions? What's been spent on the building? How much was it purchased for? And what fund did it come from?
Okay, so our Board of Education approved a $700,000 agreement with two basic goals in mind. First, the 6-story building would more efficiently serve families with a central location, more efficiently house employees who are based in our central office, and lead to greater synergies with the College of Lake County and similar programs. Second, the acquisition will help the district address space constraints by opening up the Lincoln Center for such purposes as education, preschool, after-school programs, and parent training. It was an expectation that the $700,000 would come out of the education fund and go to the operations and maintenance fund, and then land in the capital projects fund by a board resolution. This is allowed pursuant to section 17.2A of the Illinois School Code. District leadership anticipated that this planned transition to that downtown building would open up some exciting opportunities to fully utilize space at Lincoln Center, at the Lincoln Center building. There's a vision of creating updated spaces for student learning, professional development, staff training, and parent engagement. District leadership intend to ensure that whatever is done in a transparent manner and in a manner that is acceptable through statute.
All right. Thanks very much. Let me scroll to the next question. There was a question about student achievement, and let me kind of get to that again here. Looks like I've lost sight on that question here, so you'll give me just a moment. Okay, so Could you speak to, let's go back to that, to the building again. Perhaps we can kind of combine another question. Could you talk about the process of making that decision with regard to the building?
Well, it's important to mention that we brought a resolution to the Board of Education before we were able to transfer the monies. And that was at an operation services meeting. And then after that, we placed an article in the newspaper. That article was placed in the newspaper on September 27th and the 28th. Then subsequent to that, we opened and closed the hearing, and that was on October 8th, where the public, the Board of Education, and school and the district leadership can discuss what we were going to do in terms of transferring that money and for what we were going to transfer that money for. And then after the hearing, the district adopted the resolution to transfer the money. So again, we followed all of the statutory requirements in being able to transfer that money out of the education fund to the operations and maintenance fund to the capital projects fund. And we posted the notice in the newspaper and allowed the public during the hearing to voice their concerns.
Thank you. Back to the question about student achievement. There's some concerns that percentage of the budget is directed, or perhaps a greater percentage of the budget is directed toward salaries as opposed to student achievement. So there's concern about, there's an assertion that our scores are low, our students are requiring remedial attention in college because the district is failing to adequately prepare them. So there's a question about the percentage of the budget that is directed toward in-class instruction exclusive of salaries. How is your response to that question?
Well, I want to say that there's a significant amount of money that's spent on instruction. If we were to look at our budget document, we'll see that under instruction, we spend approximately $25.2 million. Under support services in the education fund as well, we spend about $18.1 million. And that's not including $12.7 million that we spend in transportation. That's directly related to our students. And that does not even include the salary and benefits of our school leaders and also our instructional leaders or the supports that are in the school. So to answer the question as it relates to non-salary benefits for things that are directly related to our students, we spend about $56 million or 20.1% of our budget, considering that our salary and benefits make up in totality about 75% of the overall budget. So there's a large part of our budget that's directly attributed to our students' education.
Great. And as you mentioned earlier, for just about every organization, a good percentage of your expenditures have to do with staff and salaries. So thanks for offering that clarity. The state offers a tax freeze to provide tax relief. There's a question about why hasn't the district applied for this more frequently, and in one time that they applied for it, it was too late. Could you explain perhaps the process there and if that assertion is accurate about applying for tax relief?
First, I want to say that that assertion is inaccurate. We pride ourselves, and anyone who works in my office or anyone who knows me, I don't wait till the last minute to look for things unless it's just a mere oversight, and that's very rare. But as it relates to the tax relief grant, I intentionally look for that to see when the window opens for us to apply. And each year that it's been available, this last year, this current year, it was not available, but the previous 2 years it was. And our district did apply, but we didn't meet the basic criteria to qualify for the tax relief grant. So in lieu of that, we opt to keep our taxes level. And that information can be found in board docs, and we presented it when we submitted our tax levy information. And even this year, we disclosed that the grant was not available, but had it been available, we would have again applied for that on time and hopes that we would have gotten it.
Mrs. Polk, let's add an additional nuance to this question around taxes and so forth, because there is significant concern about if the district has surplus, then why are they asking for money from the taxpayer? Could you clarify that and so that we can kind of ensure that we're all on the same sheet of music with regard to the levy juxtaposed against the surplus?
Mm-hmm. I kind of addressed that earlier when we looked at the slide that was related to the property taxes. But with so much uncertainty surrounding the financial climate, and even more now as COVID is upon us, we try to keep the taxpayers in mind, of which I am a part of this community and of which I pay taxes here as well. So I'm mindful, very conscious of the amount of money that we're taxing our constituents. And so we made a promise over the last, 7, 8 years that we would keep that in mind. And with the board's support, we've been able to keep and the superintendent, because I don't want to leave her out, because she also was telling me to keep the taxes level. We were able to do that. If we look at last tax year, we intentionally did not tax for approximately $900,000. Now that $900,000 is compounded each year, because we lose that as a tax base when we're levying for the next year, or when we're doing our extension for the next year. And if we keep our taxes level this year, not including debt service, we're subject to lose an additional approximately $1.2 million. And so that's what the board and the superintendent and my office is recommending to the Board of Education that we do in support of the community and not raising our taxes. So in essence, for future years, the current year and future years, we're losing that amount of money compounded each year on when we're not taxing to our full ability.
Great, thank you. There's a question about charter schools and why the district is giving money to charter schools and there's also a concern about not properly using school funds directly for children and student education. Could you speak to the charter school and any other kind of juxtaposition about how decisions are made for school funds for children?
Okay, two-part. I'll address the first one first, the charter school. If you remember, the charter school was initially brought to our district, and our district held panel discussions over at Waukegan High School Brookside campus. And it was determined at the state level, after a number of us went and testified before the state, that we really didn't want the charter school. However, the state decided that they approved the charter school. So as a result of that charter school being state approved, the monies from our evidence-based funding is taken off the top. We don't even have discretion of getting it. We don't even get the money. They take it off the top. So it's not anything that we've done. It was approved at the state level. After that, you're speaking to how the expenses are approved. Well, the budget development process, strategic budget planning, we've spoken about that. We talked about how we have that budget development committee and who's on that committee. And we try to get representatives from all across the spectrum so that we're hearing the voices of all. And we're developing that budget with the priority and the direction as given by the Board of Education and the superintendent. And so that's how the budget is developed. The sources that are used to pay for those particular initiatives or needs or priorities that have been identified, or obviously local funds, which we have the flexibility to use, and categorical aid, which is dedicated for specific purposes. And we've gone over the budget review to tell you that we make sure that the monies are allotted in the budget. We don't try to overspend, and that's evident by the fund balances that you see. And then we also make sure that whatever monies we're using to pay for whatever we're paying for, that is permissible.
Thank you. There's another question about administrative or about salaries. You spoke to kind of the overriding amount of the budget speaks to salaries. There was an additional nuance to that question about salaries, and which was amount spent on administrative salaries. Do you have those numbers?
At present, I do not have that information because the focus of this presentation was about our financial health. But upon request of the board or the superintendent, we'll provide that information.
Okay, great. So there's an additional question about why are district funds going for things that don't directly impact students of Waukegan. I think you've addressed kind of that dissection earlier in your presentation about certain things going to students, a certain percentage, certain percentage of things go to salaries, et cetera.
Yes.
There was another question that came in through the chat about school board members listening to constituents when deciding on how to vote on spending. Mrs. Polk, would you like to speak to that, or the process of how things are decided vis-a-vis the board? Or is this a question that someone else would be better to answer?
Someone else would be better to answer that question. At the conclusion of our question answer session, if we would turn it over to our board president.
Okay. Great. Mr. Ewing, I'm going to defer that question over to you. In fact, we are about 3 minutes till close. Let me just try to summarize here. I think we've heard tonight, ladies and gentlemen, an incredible picture of the management of the budget for this particular school district. It's evidenced by awards. It's evidenced by the bond rating. I thought it was pretty noteworthy to hear going back 14 years ago, a BBB to present to an A- to an A. And so we know that those are not kind of political decisions. Those are real rigorous and gruesome processes to get to those levels of bond ratings. So I think that it's pretty clear that this district has an incredible management and transparency here with regard to how their process is managed. And so hopefully, as we read in the quote earlier, this inspires hope and it inspires confidence and ultimately inspires peace. I'm sure that there are other questions, but hopefully what we've been able to do is to homogenize some questions with others to minimize some of the duplicity. I'll mention that we do have another session coming up next week, and so we'll be happy, again, if your question did not get answered or clarified, to consider it at that time. But in the interest of time today, in our attempt to respect your time and end on time, I'd like to turn the session over to Board President, Mr. Ewing, for your final remarks, sir.
Yeah, I want to first off thank the community who came out, thank both State Representative Mayfield and Senator Johnson for attending. I think if the reason that this bill was deemed necessary was because of the purchase of the First Midwest building, I would just like to state that there may be disagreements with any board and on the board as far as what we spend money on, what we don't. Even with the state panel, I don't necessarily know that everybody would agree on what that state panel decides or doesn't decide to spend money on. I think what tonight showed is that the financial of Waukegan Public School Districts are strong and that they have been improving based on the work of Ms. Polk and the finance team, the administration, and the Board of Education. And I think as we transition to site-based budgeting, you will see a budget that is also continually more reflective of what the student needs are. And so while I understand that the purchase of one building was divisive, I will restate that I don't believe that it warrants state oversight. As Ms. Polk has stated in her remarks, is the budgeting process is collaborative. It involves community members, it involves stakeholders, and so it's not made in isolation, right? And so when we look at what this was, which was to show where the district was, and that while we get the residents' frustration, this is transparent. And so I just want to, again, welcome and thank each of you all coming out. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the presentation and the thoughtfulness that went into it. And hope you all attend the next meeting at 1 p.m. I forget the date, but as Mr. Bembry said, there will be another event. And hope you all have a great night. Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Bembry. Thank you, Ms. Polk. There were questions, and I'm sorry, because before I end, you said there was a question that you deferred for me.
Yes, sir. And that question was about the listening of the board to the residents with regard to decisions about spending.
Just decisions about spending, how are they made, or?
Yeah, the assertion was that that the board did not seem to be listening to residents with regard to decisions about how things should be spent. And so perhaps you just want to give a perspective about how the board thinks and considers spending decisions in light of interest of the community.
Yeah, they're not made in isolation, and I think every board member was put there to vote their conscience. And so I do not agree with every resident in the city of Waukegan. Every resident in the city of Waukegan does not agree with me. But I do believe that myself and every board member takes this role seriously. And when things come to us, we evaluate it based on the facts and the information that we have, and we make what we feel to be the best decision at that time. I don't defend the purchase of First Midwest building is because I voted my conscience, but it was a legal vote, and a majority did decide to vote for it, and therefore we are moving forward. And I appreciate State Mayfield bringing these concerns forward. I appreciate the district for being open to the dialogue. And I hope that once again, we will be able to move forward with the understanding that the most important thing that we're focused on right now is reopening our schools. And to remind everybody that there's an election coming up and you do have the power, if you want to see change, to vote in that election. So with that, Mr. Bembry, if you want to close us out, I appreciate your time and your moderation, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much. We held you just a few minutes over, but listen, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in, for all of the questions. We trust that this has added value to your perspective about the management, the financial oversight of this district. And we look forward to our next session coming up next week. And with that, we wish you a great night. Thank you very much.